Hello guys, this is Itjustoneguy and I'm back here with another Unity tutorial. And today we're going to be replicating part of the Witcher 3 soft lock-on system. Now what we're going to replicate is whenever the camera looks at an enemy, we're going to lock onto them. And I'm just going to show you exactly how it's going to work now. Now right here we have this collider. This collider is in front of the camera. Now what the collider does is when it touches an enemy, it looks at the closest enemy within the collider. So since the collider is directly in front of the camera, it's going to be looking at the closest enemy in front of the camera. And you can see that essentially whatever I'm looking at, the target locks on and faces. And this emulates the Witcher 3's soft lock on system, at least part of it. But for practical purposes, it's basically the same thing. As you can see, it just works. Now let's go into how I did it. Now the first thing we have is this collider right here. This collider is essentially going to be following around the camera. Now the reason I didn't just make it a child of the camera is it interfered with the what do you call it? The hit detection, so the camera don't run into things. It interfered with the hit detection. When you make something a child of something, like if I were to make this a child of the camera, my hit detection script would use this collider to detect the hit instead of using this collider. So if I made this right here a child of the camera, it would mess up the hit detection. So instead, we just have it following around the camera. Now, another thing I did was I made it a child of the player. Now you might be thinking this will cause the same problem, but at the start of the game, it sets the parent to be null. And I only did this because it's good practice when you're switching levels. Because when you're switching levels, you're gonna need this to be inside the player to switch from one level to another. But what you're also gonna need is a way to unpack it and repack it. So that's just why I did that like that. Now we only have two scripts here. This tutorial soft lock script, which is on the player, and this tutorial soft lock cam script, which is on the cam object. Now another thing to note is this track enemies in cam. It doesn't follow the cam exactly. It follows a track point, which is a child of the camera. And the only reason I did that is because I have this tag main cam point, and so I don't have to actually set the main camera. I can just set it to automatically follow. Automatically find this with the tag, and then it will just set the camera itself. Now the variables we have is a list of enemies that'll be in the collider, the target in view, that's going to be the target we want to lock onto, the body of the player. Now once again, we don't use the actual player character because it has all this stuff up here. So when it's detecting the body of the player, it's going to detect that it's this big, when in reality we want the actual body. And this is used for distance, calculating distance. Now your game it may be different, but that's how I set my player up. So I just use the actual body, and that's what the body's for. And we have the range, which is basically just the range we want to search when we're looking for the closest enemy. That way we don't get a bunch of extra calculations that we don't need. Now we go to the player script, and we have the soft lock cam. That's just this script right here. Then we have the target we want to lock onto, well, the target we're going to face, the player, that's just the player itself, and how fast we want the player to rotate towards the target. So that's it for the variables. Now let's go into the actual scripts and see how I set it up. Okay, now we're here in the script, and the first thing we have is the range. The range is just going to control how far the script can detect an enemy away. Now, I would recommend setting this to 100, and the only purpose of this is so we don't have unnecessary calculations that we don't need. There's no need to detect the enemy on the other side of the level if we don't have to. Well, search for an enemy on the other side of the level if we don't have to. Next, we have a list of the enemies that'll be in the collider. Now, these will be all the enemies in front of the camera because the collider is in front of the camera. So it'll just be all the enemies in the camera view. This is the target of the camera. Now, when we select our enemy, the enemy we want to face from these enemies right here that are in the enemies in cam view, this will be the target we want to lock onto. Next, we have the body. This is the body of the player, which in my case is different from the actual player game object. That's why I set it up with the body. Next, we have the camera. The camera object that we want to follow. Now, you can set this up as the camera directly, but I set it up as an empty game object that's a child of the camera. Now, the only purpose of this is so we can follow it around. Next, we have the start function. Now, the first thing I did was set the object to have no parent. So it'll basically separate itself from the player because I made this a child of the player just for practical purposes. It's easier to keep track on and keep track of, and it's easier to deal with when you're switching levels. So the first thing I did, it does is it deparents itself. Next, if we don't have a camera object, this just finds the camera using the tag main cam point. You don't have to do this. None of this right here is essential, but this just makes it easier. That way I'm not setting the camera each time, or if I forget about the camera, which I tend to do often, so this will just make it a lot easier. Just close that right there, and close this right here. And we go into the update, and the only purpose of the update is for this to follow the camera around, which we say transform position equals cam position and transform rotation equals cam rotation. So it follows the rotation of the camera and it follows the position of the camera. Let me close this and this just to make it a little easier. Next, we go into this function right here, find soft target in camera view, and it does just what it says. It finds the target in the camera view. Now it says if the list of enemies is less than 1, just return, because we have no enemies, and so we don't want to do anything with this function, and we don't want to waste calculation power just calculating all this extra stuff. Plus, you get an error if you don't put this right here. Next, if we only have one enemy, the target equals the first enemy within the enemy list. This again is to save calculation power, so we're not searching for enemies that don't exist when we only have one. Next, if we do have multiple enemies, this just finds the closest enemy and sets it as the target. Since all the enemies in enemy in cam view are already in front of the camera because they're all the enemies in a collider, this will just find the closest one that's on the camera, in the view of the camera. Let's close this. Next, we have this function right here, Ontriggerexit, which is a Unity function used for collision detection. I don't know if you need to put this other collider here anymore, but I've always done it. I think they changed it now, but I'm not for sure, so I always put it just in case. Now, I have all my enemies tagged as AI, and that's how I find them. You might have it something different, but this is the way I had it set up. Now it just says if the other collider that this is touching, because this is the collision object that's following the camera. So basically, if the collider is touching an object tagged AI, that way it doesn't waste time calculating and adding things that are unnecessary to the list. I just had this here for testing. It's not vital or necessary, and it just loops through the enemy list, and it finds if the game object that is touching is equal to an enemy that's already on the list, it just returns. This keeps it from adding extra enemies onto the list. So you don't want to be touching one enemy and it keeps adding it to the list over and over and over again. This will stop that right here. It'll just check the list and see if we already added the enemy. And if we already added the enemy, it'll just return. And if we didn't, it'll just add the enemy for us. And that's how we get the enemy list filled. And these are all the enemies that are only touching the collider. So next we have Ontriggerexit. This is called when the collider stops touching something, and it's basically the same thing with the other. And the other tag AI only when it's touching, well, only when it stops touching an AI object. And again, this is just here for testing. It's not necessary. But what it does is it loops through the list of enemies that we have, and it says, hey, is the enemy we stopped touching or enemy on the list? And if it is, it just said, or if the enemy's target, if the enemy is a target, it it just makes the target null, because since we stopped touching the enemy that's the target, we don't want it to be on the list anymore, and we don't want it to be the target anymore. So this removes it from the target, just in case it's the target, and this removes it from the enemy list. So when we stop touching an enemy, we remove it from the list, and if that enemy is a target, then we remove it as a target. And that's how that script works. It's a pretty simple script, but I just thought I'd go through it and explain it. And I plan on posting this on Pastebin, but there have been issues with that lately, so I'm just gonna slowly go through the script in case anyone wants to copy it, just in case I'm unable to post it on Pastebin. I used to post it in the description and the links of the video, but YouTube doesn't let you do that anymore. So now, let's go on to the second script. We have tutorial soft lock. This script is a lot simpler. This is the script on the player, and first thing we have is the soft lock script, which is this script right here, and we just manually put that in the inspector. We fill this object with an inspector, and next we have our target. This is the target we want to face, and this is the player who will be facing the target. And we have our rotation speed. How fast do we want the player to turn to look at the target? Now first we go into the update, and we call from the soft lock script the function to find the closest enemy within the target view, which is the function I just explained right here. Next we say if the soft lock cam dot target in view, which is basically, does this script have a target? If it does, then the target equals the target of this script, and then it just tells it to face the enemy, which is the face target function right here. And this right here is specific to my game, because like I said before or early in the video, uh, you're gonna have to change the system from the standard Unity third-person controller system, because that system can't stray from side to side. Uh, in my game, this is the animation that allows you to switch to the lock-on system. So it's not vital for this, but it's just how I did it in my game. In fact, if you copy the script, I would erase this, because you're not going to have the soft lock parameter in your animator, and it's just going to give you an error. So let's just comment that out. Now, the last function we have right here is the face target, and it's a pretty simple script. It just rotates your character around the y-axis to face the target. So it gets the look position minus the y, and then it checks the rotation, and then it sets the rotation right here, and it rotates by the rotation speed, which is right here. And it's a piece of old code that I learned how to write a while back, a long time ago. But it does the job of just facing your player towards a target without rotating it on the y-axis. And that's it for the script. Again, I'll just go through it slowly, just for anybody who wants to look at it, in case I'm unable to post it on Pastebin. And it's a pretty simple script. It's only, what, 38 lines of code. This script goes on the player, and this script goes on the tracking object, which will follow the camera. Now let's go back to Unity and get one more look at how the whole thing works. And we're here back in Unity, and let's just get one more look at it. We have the player right here. We have our tracking object with the tutorial soft lock cam script on it. As you can see, everything here, and you can see exactly the shape that I made it. I put the box right in front of the player, just so he can detect anything in front of him. The reason I didn't put it behind the player is because if you put it behind the player, it'll pick up some enemies behind the player, which you don't want, which would have been a problem if I put it directly in front of the camera. That's why it's in front of the player, because if you're looking at an enemy, you're looking at someone in front of you 90% of the time. You're not looking at an enemy in back of you. If you were looking at an enemy in back of you, you'd turn the player. But this just ensures that it'll be looking at an enemy in front of you. Well, most of the time, depending on how you have your player rotated. But the soft lock script goes on that, and the tutorial soft lock script goes on the player. And this object right here is gonna track this right here, which I set it to follow the main cam point. So if we just hit play, you can see the first thing that the object does is deparents, and it's found our track point, and we have all our variables that we need right here. And if we go in here, you can see I set the rotation speed to 6. That's a rotation speed I'm comfortable with. That moves the player quickly enough to lock on the player, but never really takes control away from manual control away from the player. Because if you set it too fast, it'll feel like it just takes control away from the player. But now let me get the controller. Yeah. And my controller disconnected, so I gotta reconnect it. Come on. Alright, there we go. You see I walk up to the enemy. Let me just go to the track on object. And it's looking at him. And you can see me looking at the enemy, and it's picking it up. And you can see on the side, it's deleting them from the list when I look away. When I look away, I'm not locked on to them anymore. But when I look at them, I'm locked on. And if you look at the top, you can see what I was talking about when I say I didn't want to look behind the player. Like right here, I'm looking behind the player. But if I were somewhere right here, and you can see I'm looking at this player, I didn't want to pick up this player. You can see I'm looking at this enemy. I don't want to pick up this enemy behind me. And that would have been an issue there. But you can see that it works, and that's the first step to the Witcher 3 lock-on system. I may do the other parts, but essentially it's the same process, except you just determine which system you want to use. Whether you want to find an assist the direct way, where it's what the camera's looking at, or do you want to find what's directly in front of the player, or do you want to lock on to the first enemy you hit, or do you want to lock on to the first enemy that hit you, or do you want to lock on to the closest target near you? And it's a complicated system which I developed in my game, which is why I don't really want to do a tutorial on it, because it involves a lot of specific choices and a specific way of doing things. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Uh, this is a little part I thought of after I finished recording the video, and I just thought I'd add this on at the end. I don't know how helpful this will be to other game developers, but I find this immensely helpful. This is actually a list of all the stuff I had to do to fix in the game, which is just a lot of little stuff, but also some big stuff too. But this is really helpful to me, and this is basically the stuff I'm gonna be working on. But the first one was redo the combat system because I wasn't happy with it, and I felt I could do better than the combat AI. Make the D-pad usable in the main menu. That turned out to be pretty easy. Got that done today too, and just a bunch of little glitches. But this is all the stuff I'm gonna be doing: monsters, animals, horses, add all the weapon type of animations. I wanted to finish the combat system before I did that, just so I wouldn't have to redo every single weapon, because it's not going to be one weapon. It's going to be like daggers, swords, bows, staffs, hammers, all that stuff. And that could have got pretty tedious if I had to redo a whole combat system after I put in weapon animations. And but mostly I want to get to this AI stuff, which is just going to be brutal. Well, not brutal, because I already know how to do it. It's just that it's going to take a long time, and I have to get it all to work together. A mini map, that's going to be pretty interesting to create, because I've never done that before in Unity. And I just wanted to show you a little bit of how my thinking was, all the stuff I had to fix, and all the little glitches and everything like that, just to give you a little behind the scenes of how I actually do this stuff. Add more stats to the UI, redo the skill menu, make items tradable. Like right now, I don't know why I didn't do that before. I guess because I intended for all the systems to be separate, so I never wanted to integrate the item system with the money system. But I figured in whatever. Add proper keyboard controls. Just never bothered to do that because I never played with the keyboard. But yeah. But this is just a little behind the scenes. So anyway, that's it. Thank you for watching.